welcome to Simply Tax. On our last episode of the podcast, we took a look at a tax season packed with tax changes and operational challenges stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic with BKD's Jesse Palmer and Jean Morgenthaler. We're back today to continue our exploration into the tax season not normal with Taxgirl. Not a tax girl, but the tax girl, Kelly Phillips Erb, who in addition to being the managing shareholder at the Erb law firm, where she focuses on tax law including domestic and international estate and tax planning, compliance, and tax controversy matters. She also writes extensively about tax as a senior contributor at Forbes and in her weekly column at Bloomberg Tax. I'm excited to share with you on the podcast today our conversation that covers how she became tax girl, the challenges and changes that taxpayers and tax practitioners face this season, tips for the current situation, and her advice for a successful career in tax, and writing about it. We even touch on her wise parenting advice for me, as someone who also raises children while doing this tax thing. Let's jump in, starting with Kelly's background.
I'm Kelly Phillips Erb, and I'm known around social media as Taxgirl. And that sort of started a little bit as a joke because in law school, I had sworn the one class that I would not take was tax law. And I ended up through a series of events taking a tax class that I really enjoyed, but it was an upper level class. And I managed to get through taking a bunch of those and realized I'd never taken baby tax, which is the intro to tax. So I had to go back and take baby tax when I got my master's in tax. So I was pretty thoroughly known at that point as the tax girl. So when I got my first law job, my second law job, people kind of joked and called me tax girl. And so my email became taxgirl at. And then at the law firm, when I started my own practice, I automatically was taxgirl at. I've never been Kelly at or any of those versions at the law firm. Then I started my blog a few years later, and kind of the rest is taxgirl history.
That's really neat. I like that, how it sort of became the thing that you thought you wouldn't like the most, but it's obviously taken on a life of its own and clearly something you're passionate about. Just, I think if anybody reads anything you've written, you can just tell that. But what do you think it was? What really drew you to it once you got past that initial maybe stigma or whatever it was that told you you weren't going to like that class?
Well, I think I had the same stereotypes a lot of people have about tax law, that it was really dry and black and white, which is funny now, right? And, not a lot of room for analysis or policy. It seemed all very rule oriented. That was sort of the outside view of it. And this professor I actually took a gift tax class. And again, so I kind of went through the whole tax syllabus in kind of a not so direct way, but I took this gift tax class and I was really fascinated at all of the analysis that went into, the simplest of things, like making a gift to your kid. And it dawned on me kind of throughout that class and then subsequent classes that tax actually affects so much of what we do. It affects sometimes where you live, what you do for a living, whether you get married or not. There's so many decisions have a tax component. And I was sort of sucked in by this notion that, unlike maritime law, which I took and really enjoyed, but it didn't, maritime law wasn't going to be something that I lived. And tax law is something that, again, and we're seeing it now with the current coronavirus crisis, but it affects so many pieces of our lives. And that to me is just really fascinating. We kind of joke in my house, which is kind of sad that my children have grown up in this world, but there's nothing that they can talk about that I can't think of a tax angle. And they're doing it themselves too, which I know they hate at this point, but they'll be watching a movie and something will happen and my kids will be like, oh gosh, but what if? Because now they kind of think that way too. But it's really fascinating to think about, again, the role that tax and accounting plays in all of our lives.
No, I love that. It's continued on. You've instilled it in your kids. That's great. Talking about how it really just touches everything in terms of everyday life. Obviously, when things kind of get turned upside down, like they are right now, in a way, that really changes things. And I feel like this time of year, usually I'm having the conversation or I'm getting the common question of, how was tax season? What was it like this year? Whatnot, right? So I'll ask you that, obviously with the backdrop of knowing it wasn't really a normal tax season, I guess, if you will, but how was
Right.
tax season?
So never ending, right? Tax season continues. It's been really challenging for a lot of folks in the profession, including myself, not only because we have this new stuff we have to learn, right? Because now we have to understand payroll taxes and PPP and how the stimulus checks work and what the new rules are regarding charitable contributions. And there's so much new happening. And there's always something new happening, right, with respect to tax. But I think what's really different about it happening now is, first of all, the timing. So it's not unusual for something to happen in December, and then we have to scramble to get up to speed on it come, January, February. But the new things keep happening. New guidance keeps getting released. So we're dealing with that on top of trying to assist taxpayers in a time that's both informationally challenging for them, like trying to understand for as a taxpayer what the deadlines are and what does it mean to me and what are my options in terms of suspending installment agreements and all of these other things at the same time that we can't talk to IRS. So it's been like constant punching. Once you figure, it's like a tax whack-a-mole. You finally figured that you've kind of gotten everything under control and something else pops up.
I would imagine a lot of the times when you're going through and, like you said, trying to digest these new provisions or changes or report on them, there's a number of sources that you work with and the kind of normal channels. But I don't know, have those been impacted with everything going on?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just even little things like, I know people begrudge IRS a lot, but normally if I have a question with respect to something coming out or from a media standpoint that I need clarification on, you can get a pretty immediate feedback from the newsroom. That's not the same right now. And again, that's because IRS is also teleworking. So news is filtering out more slowly. It's also harder to confirm things. When you watch and I joke about this a lot, but I had been watching all of the press conferences, and that one press conference that I watched with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, that it was really both confusing and you felt like even he was sort of saying things off the cuff. And then we watched, it was hard to get confirmation of what was right and what was not. I watched that press conference like 5 times to make sure I transcribed what he said exactly as he said it. But then to watch people on social media kind of argue about what he said versus what he meant, and then to see that we were having the actual filing deadline extended by tweet, which is really different. And, it's desperate times, desperate measures, I guess. But it was really interesting to see that happen kind of in real time. It was funny because every year I write an April Fool's post. And this year I made a joke about IRS joining TikTok. And one of the things I said was, if Mnuchin can change the tax deadlines by tweet, why can't Reddick change the regulations by TikTok? And it was really interesting to me because a lot of folks were like, maybe that's not so far off. Sort of kind of how we all been joking that the Onion doesn't feel like satire anymore. So it was incredibly difficult to find something to write about on April Fool's that wasn't more outlandish than what was actually happening during our, real tax season.
It really has been very interesting, like you said, in terms of maybe that's like way oversimplifying it, right? But I mean, it really is in all senses of the word. But you kind of mentioned that things can kind of run a little rampant in terms of how people can talk about them, or maybe even just debate them, because like you said, if you're going off the cuff, sometimes precision in terminology doesn't always translate, I guess. Have you found that there's been a lot of confusion and misinformation circling around, particularly in light of all these changes?
Yes. I will say it's the worst I've ever seen in terms of reporting. And that's not a slam on my fellow journalists. I do think I mentioned earlier, there's a lot going on. First of all, the the normal order of the filter of information has changed. You used to be able to reliably depend on an IRS memo, or we used to have phone conversations with folks. That's not happening. There's a lot of stuff happening all at the same time. And again, you have the Treasury Secretary basically making policy on Twitter. And again, I'm not necessarily critiquing that, because I do think, we have to change the way that we deliver information as the world changes. I just think it caught a lot of people off guard. And sort of running parallel to all this is you have scammers who are taking advantage of people, and a lot of misinformation that's out there generally. And so what happens is you have had a lot of stories where news stories where that's been parroted or distributed, and it's confusing taxpayers. And that, to me, as as someone who works with taxpayers and writes for taxpayers, is really frustrating. And I'll give you a perfect example. There was a lot of talk about the second stimulus check, which isn't happening. Like, I just want to say right now, that's not law. I mean, that it's a proposal. There've been a bunch of different variations on this proposal, but I've seen headlines that are leading taxpayers to believe that they're actually getting another one next month. And that's so frustrating, because people are arranging their lives around things that they believe are happening from a tax policy standpoint. Another really good example is that in one of the early versions of the CARES Act, you may recall that there was a requirement that you have earned income in order to get a stimulus check. That was not in the final version, but a lot of folks reported it as though it was the final version. So I've received a number of emails from taxpayers where they're like, what do I do? I don't have food on the table and I don't make any money. Why don't I get a check? And I have to say to them, you do get a check. You just need to make sure you register as a non-filer with the IRS. And, folks just weren't. I don't want to suggest that it's purposeful, except for the scammers. But the folks who are misreporting, I don't want to suggest that it's purposeful. But I just think that right now we're being overwhelmed with so much information in a place where we can't always immediately verify it with colleagues at the water cooler or phone call to IRS. And I think that what's happening is that it's resulting in a lot of spread of bad information, which is not good for taxpayers.
Very frustrating at a time when people need it the most, like you just said. So, I know that over the years, I feel like you've always done a very good job of helping to draw attention to scams and things that are going on, particularly with the IRS. And I guess any words of wisdom or things you would say there to really help people with that?
Oh my gosh, that could be another podcast completely on its own. But yeah,
probably could. Yeah.
So you may know that on Twitter, I was complaining because there was a dummy account set up using my name. It's been taken down now, thank goodness. But it was up for a few days, and it was where criminals were tweeting out stories with misinformation, purposeful misinformation about stimulus checks, and directing taxpayers to email them. And there was an email in every link. In every tweet. And it was to either an IRS.com or a USA.com or some variation of that. And so my one, consistent piece of information, although I would love for you to use trusted sources and, go to my website, but if you ever have a concern about whether something is true or not, start with irs.gov. I mean, it's actually a remarkably well done website. I know people want to hate on the IRS, but the website's really well done for, a government website. And you're not going to be asked to go to a private vendor site or to email your personal information to a .com or even a .gov. The IRS isn't soliciting that information either. So if you have questions, if there's a portal that you need to update information, if there's a question, always start at irs.gov. And that's true not only for taxpayers, but tax professionals. I know that we did the happy hour via Zoom, and the impersonator picked up on that too and was trying to direct tax professionals to email information to them about their own practice. And it was clearly, a phishing scheme. So I would say that, my number one consistent piece of information is when in doubt, assume it's a scam and go to a primary source like irs.gov. Don't follow links. Don't click on things. Don't email people that you don't know. Be wary of people who ask for too much information. Like if you're going to go to a Zoom happy hour, you should know that you shouldn't have to, provide your social or your P10. So that kind of stuff, especially at a time when people are anxious and they're worried about their money, I think they're more likely to trust a site that might not be good. And then, also parallel with that is this notion of if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. I've had a lot of folks that have let me know that, and I tweeted about this the other day, but there was a few readers that contacted me to let me know that they were told that because I had posted about amended tax returns and that those were paper returns, and the IRS is not processing those right now, so there's a wait. But folks said that they were told that for a fee they could e-file their amended return, and that's not true. And I've also been told that taxpayers have been told that for a fee they can expedite their stimulus check. Also not true. So, be careful. And also, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
It's just terrible. I mean, it really is when people prey on those types of situations, and it's so important to get the word out. And I feel like you really do a great job of that,
Thank you.
and in a way that people can understand. Because again, I think part of the challenge here is I think there's a natural intimidation to the tax law and to the IRS, and people there's an emotional reaction that happens if you get any sort of letter or notice. I mean, even sometimes if they're good, I feel like those that I work with will, they just don't like it. They don't like getting anything
Right.
from the IRS. And then you couple that with just the complexity and everything going on. So, I do feel like you have a great ability to sort of boil it down and explain it in a way that's really resonates with people, and by it, I mean the tax law, all aspects of it. What's it been like to kind of navigate everything that's been coming down, some of those provisions as of late?
It's been a lot of reading on my part. So I mentioned earlier about Mnuchin's press conference. I've been making a real effort to, absolutely address it at the source. So if somebody tells me Mnuchin said, I want to hear Mnuchin say it. If somebody says there's a memo from Ways and Means Committee, I want to see that memo. So there's been a lot of that. And then also with the CARES Act, I mean, the CARES Act was really long, which is, I think, what's intimidating for a lot of folks. But rather than have people say, this is what it says, and listen to somebody else explain it, I read it. And my husband was making fun of me because I stayed up very, very late to read it and wrote a summary about it. And then the next day, somebody on Twitter said, I don't believe you read it. Like, it's too long. And I was joking that they should talk to my husband and kids, because when they went to bed, I was still up reading that act. But I think it's really important to read it at the source and see what it says. A great example of that is the PPP issue. People were worried about whether or not the forgiveness would be considered taxable income. It's in the bill that's accepted. That's an exemption. The forgiveness would not be considered income, and that's in the bill. But you have to read it to see that. So I think in a situation where I might normally, I try to read everything anyway, but in a situation where I might normally call someone and say at IRS and say, can you clarify this for me? I've been doing a lot of just, slogging through legislation. I stayed up to watch the vote on the CARES Act to make sure, and we were joking because it was annoying me. There was one senator that took a really long time to vote, and I just wanted him to vote so I could go to bed. And there were, of course, 4 senators that didn't vote because they were like Senator Paul and Senator Romney because of illness. So I knew how many votes were to be cast. And I think at one point it was 95-0 when I knew that it had passed, but I just wanted to make sure it was finalized. And I think that's really important anytime you write about anything, especially tax law for taxpayers, is you need to make sure that that the period's been put at the end of the sentence, because as we know, one little word, one little amendment can change everything. So you want to make sure that it's right before you write it and before you tell taxpayers.
Do you think there's any provisions maybe that aren't getting the attention yet that maybe they will? Because obviously there's the stimulus, and that's literally hitting people right in their bank accounts or in their mailboxes, and the PPP and all of that went with that. But there is obviously a lot to all of the relief provisions.
Yes.
Yeah, are there things you think that people maybe aren't focusing on, or
Oh,
that perhaps
sure.
they're just not hearing about yet?
Sure. So I think that one of the most important things that's being overlooked is the ERC, the Employee Retention Credit, which applies to small businesses. I think that there's a real bonus in using that because it's no extra paperwork. There's no application. It is based off of existing returns. It's basically a credit for payroll, not payroll taxes, but it's a credit for payroll against your payroll taxes. It's refundable and you can actually ask for it in advance. And so that combination of factors, I think makes it really attractive for small businesses, but I think it got lost in the noise of people applying for the PPP or the EIDL. And so I think that the ERC is definitely being overlooked. I also think that, there's a couple of things. The requirement that you don't have to take the RMD for 2020. I think that's helpful for folks right now because the markets are down and you don't want your required minimum distribution would have been calculated off of how it was doing before all the markets went down. So to not be forced to take that contribution if you don't need it, I think is really useful. Some of the other favorable tax treatment for retirement accounts that allow you to make withdrawals and put them back in and stretch out taxation. I think those are very important and they're not really being looked at. So Forbes's Ashley Ebling does a good job of reporting this, but I am planning a couple of little follow-ups on that because I'm hearing a lot of people asking me, well, what happens if I take money out of my IRA? Those sorts of things. So I think a lot of those individual provisions or the smaller relief, well, what appears to be, smaller relief when you put it up against, a $10 million loan are really being ignored by a lot of folks. And I think that they would actually be incredibly useful.
A lot of the focus, the noise, right? It really centered around the PPP, and yeah, there are a lot of other pieces there. So I guess with that in mind, and particularly because this is so important to small businesses and just making it through this challenging time that we're in, do you have any tips or advice for kind of approaching the next couple months ahead, either from a tax perspective or I guess even just overall holistically on just making it through?
Well, I think from a tax perspective, especially for small businesses, I think it's really important to be in contact with your team right now. And I think that's intimidating for a lot of folks because, when income isn't coming in, you don't want to spend. So people are maybe reluctant to pick up the phone and call their accountant or their tax attorney or their bookkeeper. But I think it's really important because first of all, you need to know where your finances are all of the time, but especially, what if you're not going to make payroll this month? And then secondly, to find out what kind of options are available, not only just on the small business side, like for the ERC or the PPP, but individual taxpayers. Like sometimes, I always say that most things in tax can be fixed, but you have to be smart about them. And I've had a lot of taxpayers like rushing to file amended returns to take their 17-year-old off because they want the 17-year-old to get a stimulus check. You need to think about what that does long term. So, how does that affect your filing overall? So I think it's a really good time generally to re-examine where you are financially and then also look at what this means in terms of what kind of relief is owed to you. And then also know that, there's a lot of people, going back to my earlier point about people who weren't earning an income weren't going to get a check, even though we know that's not true now. Those folks still weren't getting it. And those are the people who needed it, senior citizens. Like there's a lot of those folks. So I think one of the things I've learned during the crisis, which has made me very optimistic about our profession generally, is, you always hear a lot of stories about during this time, keep hearing the bad stories and the greedy people and the scams. One of the things I've noticed is how many people are willing to help, not only with each other. So tax professionals being such a great community where, when people have a question, they're shooting a note over and saying, what would you do in this situation? And you have somebody saying, well, let me call and walk you through it. So many of my colleagues I've watched help other colleagues figure out PPP loans. That's been really encouraging. But also on the taxpayer side, I think we're all very aware that not all taxpayers can afford some of the rates that professionals charge. And And that's not a slam on the professionals, but you should get paid what you're worth. But that also means that we should be willing to help people that might have more simple questions, figure it out, whether that's helping somebody navigate the stimulus check issue, knowing whether or not they should file as a dependent, or advising people not to claim their spouses as dependents. And a lot of that isn't hard on the tax professional side. It might be difficult for the taxpayers, but it's not hard to tell somebody what the rules are for dependents. And I love that tax professionals have been stepping up to the plate. A great example of this is that when I was first working through a lot of my email volume, which was very, very crazy, I noticed kind of a pattern for the folks who either didn't have any income, or especially homeless folks. And the homeless people in particular that were emailing me, it was actually, as a parent, it was really kind of a sad place to notice. But, when kids turn 17 or 18, they tend to age out of foster care. And so if they don't have a job lined up, then they don't have a place to live. These kids who are now out on their own, as one kid pointed out to me, $1,200 will give him living expenses for 3 months. This is what he told me. And he didn't know how to get a check because he doesn't file taxes, because he's never earned money and enough to file, and he doesn't have an address. And so what could he do? And so I was able to help him, but then I realized there were a lot of folks in that same boat. So I reached out to, on social media, to tax professionals, and there were so many of them that were willing to say yes. If somebody has a question and they live in my town, I'm happy to give them a phone call. So I think that's terrific that, with all the negative things we've seen, there's also a real positive that people are willing to help. And I hope that increasingly, and once this passes, that we don't lose that we remember that it's important to help people navigate what, as we were talking about it just at the top of the program, is often really complicated material. But we know the answers, right? That's what we get paid to do. So when we know the answers, why wouldn't we share them with people who need them? So I love that that's what's happening. And I hope that continues. And I hope that, taxpayers who are in need of help continue to seek out help, whether it's at the IRS information or somewhere else.
Another area of interest that I always have is, maybe to that end, is looking at other professionals, tax professionals, maybe that are just starting out, or they're in school and they're aspiring to be a tax professional, and maybe even more specifically in your case, to write about tax. So I guess, what advice would you have for those that are in that situation?
Well, I think just from the professional side, before I talk about the writer side, I would just say to just be open to the different kinds of things that are out there, and not to feel pressured to get a niche right from the beginning. I know a lot of times people get frustrated because they become the SALT lawyer or the estate lawyer. That can be really smart to be that person, but you won't know that until you kind of dipped your toe in all of it, right? So I think one of the great things about going to school or taking one of the, the EA courses, or there's a lot of different opportunities to learn tax, is kind of take a dip in all of it and see what you like. Maybe you're not a return person. I wasn't. I am not. I love numbers. Like, I love doing the math, but I did not want to do the returns. It's not something that's interesting to me. I actually like fixing problems. So I ended up doing more either on the planning side, kind of warding off the problems in advance, or how do you fix things that have gone wrong? So I think you take what your strengths are, like in your everyday life, and take an interest in a lot of things, rather than necessarily follow a prescribed course, and figure out what it is that you're good at and what you want to do. If you like people, maybe you don't want to be in an office cubicle in the back. You want to be on the front asking people data entry questions or helping with planning. So I think there's a lot of ways to incorporate the things that you love into tax law and accounting. And that is something that, I do say a lot, because I never saw myself doing what I do now, because it at first didn't seem like the kind of thing that I thought I'd be good at. The writing piece actually came because I always loved to write. I wanted to be a writer. I remember one of my professors in college telling me that you can't make a living being a writer. And so I was like, oh, okay. I just believed them. But I actually started writing directed towards my clients, and then it grew from there. So on the writing side, I was really lucky in that I think some people, and I started my blog in a different world than we're in now, but I started my blog because it was something that I was interested in that I wanted to share with people. I didn't look at it straight as how can I make money off of this? How can I attract an audience? Again, my original audience was actually existing clients. I wasn't using it as a way of attracting clients. It did work out that way, but that wasn't what it was intended for. And I was actually one of, I think, kind of the first few folks in the space to not be a technical writer. Eva Rosenberg is another really great example of somebody who is the same. Kay Bell. There were a few of us, but I think so much of the writing at the time was technical. And kind of going back to what I had said about your professional career, I knew that wasn't going to be my thing. I'm not a technical writer. I'm a country girl from rural North Carolina originally, and I tell stories. That's how I learned to write. I learned to write by listening to my great grandmother talk about growing up. And I always thought, I want to be able to tell stories like she does. So when I write, I write like I'm talking to people. And that's been my audience, rather than I'm not picking something apart at a high level. But I will say there are people who do pick things apart at a high level and they're good at it. So like Tony Needy, for example. So I think that part of being successful at writing, whether it's, writing generally or something like tax writing, is to find what you're good at, find what you're interested in, and then don't change who you are. Because I think that had I tried to become a more technical writer, I would not have been successful. That being said, I am sometimes cringe when I look at my really early writing because it's so casual and so snark. And I think I owe a lot to a bunch of different people. One of them is my editor at Forbes, is Janet Novak. And especially when I was writing for the magazine, would sometimes come back to me and explain to me that, I just said something in 5,000 words that I should have said in 500. So she was really great at helping me learn how to have a little bit of a more editorial eye towards what I write. So I try to be really thoughtful about that to this day. Although, nobody, whether at Forbes or Bloomberg or any other place, is ever going to call me brief, as you can tell from this interview. But I do think that with writing it, you can tell what's forced. When you read a piece that feels like a bunch of sentences just thrown together, even if it's technically correct, if you don't want to keep reading it, that's not good. I want my readers to not only understand what I'm saying about stimulus checks, but come back to find out what I've said about child support. So I think that, that's you find your voice and you stay with it and you try to be consistent, which is not the same as not growing. I think I'm a much better writer now than I used to be. And I try to get better every time I write, and I appreciate feedback. It's what makes me better. But I think that you have to start out by having a voice and not being afraid to use it.
Just speaking from experience, I appreciate feedback, but sometimes it is hard to actually apply it and make the change. How long has it been since you started writing for Forbes and the like?
I wrote for about 7 years on my Taxgirl blog. It wasn't always called Taxgirl, but I was always Taxgirl writing on it, but the name of it evolved a little bit. But actually bought the domain. I'm trying to remember when I did. It was a while ago, and it was a big deal because it was back in the day when, domains were selling like hotcakes and people were paying tons of money for them. And I remember thinking it became available and I really wanted it. And I can't remember how much I paid. I want to say it was like $500 or something. I know it was over 100. And I remember thinking this could be a huge mistake. This just feels so extravagant, because domains were being sold for $7 a pop. And here I was paying this kind of money for it. But I also knew that I wanted to establish my brand, and I didn't want to keep moving around. I wanted it to be, I started out at intoxicated.blogspot.com. I remember that was my first real blog. And that was after I had already done a little bit of a blog on the back end at our website. So when I bought taxgirl.com, it was a huge step for me. For a very long time, thought only my dad was reading, dad and a couple of clients who would sometimes send me email. And then I got a notice from the American Bar Association Journal that my blog had been nominated as one of the top legal blogs of the year. And I thought, oh my gosh, like people are reading this. This is crazy. So that went on for, I continued to write as a solo for a little bit. And then Forbes gave me a shout one day and asked if I had any interest in writing for them. And the interesting thing about that was, and I remember the piece that I wrote, it was about tax amnesty. And I compared the different programs in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And New Jersey, ironically, had taken this really taxpayer friendly approach to its amnesty program, which is sort of the way I've always viewed amnesty programs. This notion that if you owe money, like now is your chance to fix things. Like this is your big opportunity, right? So New Jersey really pitched it that way. And I remember thinking that was great. And, but I live in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania had an amnesty program at the same time. This was, I think, 2011. They had this commercial, and I'll never forget it. They had an actual TV commercial for it where they had, it was when Google Maps was just becoming popular, and they had a shot from over a house, and they say, "We know where you live." And then you'd hear this like camera, and they would show you where they were zooming in, and they were like, "And we will find you."
Wow.
And so it was really scary.
Yeah.
It was this whole, yeah. And so I wrote this piece about how I don't think you have to be Big Brother and be scary to have a successful amnesty program. And it turns out that New Jersey's program was wildly more successful than Pennsylvania's. So I had written this article about it. And that was the article that Forbes saw. And they wrote me and they said, can we reprint this? And I said, sure. And right after I had done it, one of my friends who wrote for a living was like, "Are you crazy? You don't give anybody anything for free." And I'm like, "This is Forbes. Like, why would I not give it to them for free?" And it turned out to be a very good move on my part because they liked it so much that they asked me if I'd become a regular writer for them. And I did. I freelanced for them for a little bit. And then a few years ago, I had the opportunity to be a full-time staffer at Forbes, which I did take. And I stayed for a bit, but then ultimately just decided to come back to the practice of law. So now I am practicing as an attorney, and I do still write for Forbes. I'm a senior contributor with them. And I also have a weekly column with Bloomberg Tax. So I love the writing. I think the writing also helps me stay on top of things. Sometimes you get up and you just don't want to read another thing, and I have to. So I think it makes me a better attorney. Kind of the flip side to that, which is one of the reasons I returned to the practice, is that I think that being an attorney also makes me a better writer because I have firsthand experience with a lot of these things that I'm writing about. Like I know what it's like to be a tax professional sitting on hold with the IRS for 2 hours. So so when I write about it, it's not just something that someone told me. I've been on the phone. I know what that's like. I've seen taxpayers sitting across from me crying because they think they're going to lose their homes. That gives me a really good perspective. I didn't plan my trajectory as a writer that way, but I'm glad that it happened that way because I feel like along the way, I've had a lot of opportunities to, become a better writer and become a better attorney.
Yeah, that firsthand practical, experience definitely comes through. And I think that's where I'll say myself personally, I look forward to reading your articles for that reason, because there's always some sort of an insight in there or something that I can relate to, or, it kind of pulls it out.
Thank you.
So thank you. I don't know that I've actually thanked you formally. So thank you for that.
Oh,
Because
I
that
appreciate that very
definitely
much.
does a lot for the tax community, for taxpayers. For sure it does. So what are maybe some closing thoughts that you would leave listeners with?
So I would say about the season, I would just remind taxpayers that, this is it's a pretty crazy time and nobody knows what to expect. So I would say be patient, both with the IRS and with your tax professional, but also be kind to yourself. If you don't have the money to pay your taxes this time, or if you're stressing about filing dates, I think the IRS is going to be reasonable as tax season gears up, which is an insanely weird thing to say. But as we roll into July, if you haven't filed yet, I would just say not to panic. I do think that we're going to have the ability to, smooth over a lot of things. I know that there's a lot of anxiety right now, so it makes it more difficult to take a step back. But I've had so many panicked phone calls from people who are worried because what if they did the wrong thing? I think we're going to have lots of time to fix it. And tax season is still a few months away. So, or the end of tax season is still a few months away. So I think that my big piece of advice would be just to be patient. I think that it's an unusual time, but I also think that it's an unusual time for everybody. This isn't the kind of situation where we had with Harvey or Katrina or something that was specific to one area where there was a lot of taxpayers that were having difficulties. No, we're all in the same boat. So, and I think that IRS understands that. And I think it's all going to work out. So I would just say, for a lot of folks who have kind of anticipatory anxiety, to take a deep breath because it's all going to be okay.
Great advice. Great advice. And it is sometimes hard to do. I've been, I guess, had people say to me that, oh, it's kind of going to see you is like going to the dentist. I
Oh,
don't really
gosh.
like, I'm like, oh, thanks. It's like, oh, no, I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean like I get very nervous when I go to the dentist. And I'm like,
Right.
oh, so maybe there's the anxiety, but then, yeah, you layer in the situation and the realities of everything going on. And that's just, it just obviously very heightened situation. I think that's really great advice. And so, back on the overall profession front, the writing front, career wise, what advice would you give and kind of closing thoughts would you leave people with?
If you ever chat with me for any period of time, and even in this conversation, one of the things that I hope that I put across is that I have been very fortunate to find and surround myself with amazing people. So whether it's my editor or colleagues, whether they're virtual or not, I think nobody, despite what we sometimes see in Hollywood movies, nobody is completely self-made. And I think that when you start on your journey as a professional, and again, whatever it is, whether you're going to be a lawyer or an accountant or a writer, you need to find that person or people that are going to want you to be a success too. There's that great Mark Twain quote, don't surround yourself with people who belittle your ambitions, be friends with people who want to make you great too. So I think that's really valuable in the profession. Like, find people that you like or that you admire and say hello to them. Go to conferences, even if they're remote. One of the, I think, great things that's come out of this pandemic is all of these virtual meetings that we're having. Like, on some level, I can see where it can be tiresome. But on the other hand, sometimes you don't either have the money, especially if you're just starting out, the money or the time, like if you're a parent like me, to fly off to, Dallas to meet the 100 other tax people. All of these virtual socials and webinars are a really great way to meet people. And I think that as you become more successful in your career, so much of it is about just meeting people who make you feel comfortable and who you can not only look to, but also when you have questions, ask, like, is this a good thing to do? And I don't mean like the goofy LinkedIn the second you accept a friend request or like introduce me to everybody you know. Like, I don't mean like that. I mean the ones where you meet someone at a conference and you send them the note afterwards that said, it was really great meeting you. What advice do you have for me as I take my EA exam? Or I'm sending out a resume and I'm really nervous. Should I send one out to 10 big firms or is it better to stay at a smaller firm? Like, I think somebody having that you can use as a sounding board is just really super important. And I think that this pandemic, ironically, you'd feel like it would be making us more isolationist, but I do think it's actually making us oddly more social on some level. And I think that's good. And then also, like, resources like this podcast, like finding people in the industry that you either want to be like, or that you've heard something that they've said that resonated with you, or you want to learn more. Like, I think that's really smart too. Just aligning yourself with really good people.
From my experience, that couldn't be a truer statement, and so I was honored to be able to have you on because again, you want to surround yourself by those that know their stuff, and that's
Thank you.
yeah, and but I like that. Again, it's a human level, right? Just kind of reaching out to people, and even just. I mean, I love that idea, the Zoom happy hour and things like that, just to kind of get tax professionals together or, get to know each other on a personal level. And you did mention the parent thing in there. I know from following you on social media as well that, yeah, obviously that's a very important part of your life, significant part of your life as well.
Yes.
So I have twins that are 5, so I'm
Oh my
still
gosh.
like learning how to. Yeah, I know. It's a boy and a girl, so they kind of balance each other out to a certain extent. I don't
Right.
know. It's very interesting, but I've still got a lot to learn on that journey. any tips you would give me for as a fellow tax professional raising children?
That you have no control over anything. We used to joke all the time about our kids. We'd said when they were growing up that they could grow up to be anything that they wanted except a lawyer or an exotic dancer, and we were willing to bend on the exotic dancer. And I can tell you that my middle child won best advocate at her mock trial, so I think we're losing that battle. She's my next lawyer to be. So I think it's funny, when I was growing up, I was going to be a teacher actually before I became a lawyer, and I took a lot of child psych classes, and I was so sure that it was all nurture, right? That like you could raise those kids to be the people that you thought they should be, and they come out and they're their own little people immediately, and just kind of smacks you in the face as a parent that you don't have a lot of control sometimes over who they become. But I love that my kids see me work. I love that my kids have been at the office. They sometimes are forced to listen to my interviews. My one daughter relays a story that she was on the bus one time, and they were listening to in Philadelphia, and they were listening to WOGL on the radio, and they said, "Next up, Kelly Phillips Erb will answer your tax questions." And my daughter said everybody looked at them. It's like, "Is that your mom?" And they were so like horrified and excited all at the same time. But I think that's like, I love that my kids see me work and know what I do, because I think it's so important that they grow up knowing that they should do something they like. So that would be my big advice for you, is that, you can't control a lot of what goes on. Like I don't think you can change their personalities. They are who they are. But I think just showing them that you like what you do and that's important, as a career. Because I do think, especially my kids are a little older than yours. I have one that's starting college next year, and she's worried in advance about jobs and what does all this mean, and what if there's a recession and I can't get work. And I just say, like, it will work out, and figure out what you want to do, and just follow that dream. And it doesn't have to be like, I'm not talking about like get the theory, like literally don't work, just do it, sit in a corner somewhere. But she knows what I mean. She's a hard worker. But I just think that's really important as a parent, to make sure that we can expose our kids to a lot of what we do. I if you've seen me on Twitter, I actually get really annoyed by people who pretend that somehow their work and their home lives never collide, and somehow that's because they're such magical, wonderful parents. I think that they necessarily have to collide sometimes, or that you have outside help. And I think that, it's important that we're transparent about that. Other parents need to know that it's not always easy, but worth it. Not always easy.
Yeah, it's not always easy, but definitely worth it. And I will agree with you on that. There's no way for them not to overlap. And it is kind of funny. It's like this experience. My daughter, actually a couple of the episodes ago on the podcast, she ended up in introduction because she wanted to do the podcast thing like dad.
Oh, that's so cute.
It was kind of fun. But that's also what's interesting is, and I live in a high rise in downtown Chicago. And so they're like literally in the other room, because we're kind of in smaller space here together. So I'm just, kind of going back and forth to work. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting thing, because they've definitely seen a lot more of what I do, even though a lot of it's obviously sitting at a computer and talking on the phone and doing interviews. But that's really great though. I like that, yeah, you can't really change who they're going to go with. It's kind of like that writing style tip that you gave as well, right? That you kind of got to be true to yourself. The kids are kind of the same way, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, this has been great. I again appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate all the work that you do, the staying up late at night, reading and rereading things, so that that tax professionals like myself and others out there can digest this stuff, and taxpayers can understand this stuff, especially the stimulus checks right now, and avoid the things that are, well, there's the negative and the positive like we talked about. So again, great talking with you, and thank you again.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you did as well. Please learn more about Kelly and check out the links to her articles in the show notes of this episode, which are available at bkd.com/simplytax. I would also love to hear from you and know what you thought of the episode and think of the podcast. Please drop us an email at simplytax@bkd.com and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. I would also really enjoy connecting with you on social media. You can find me out on Twitter, where I tweet about tax, Damien Martin CPA. On Instagram, where I post about my life at the intersection of tax and being a dad at TaxDad. On YouTube, by subscribing to our Simply Tax YouTube channel, and out on LinkedIn. I'm Damien Martin, and thank you for listening.
The information contained in this episode of Simply Tax is based on data available as of the date of its release. BKD is under no obligation to update this information if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances. Any information provided is not to be considered as tax, legal, or financial advice. Please consult your tax advisor before acting on any matters covered.